Thank you very much to all our speakers, and I welcome them to turn their cameras back on. We have had several questions come in through the Q&A chat, and we'll try and answer as many of them live as we can. And if we don't get to all of them, we'll still provide some form of written response after the webinar is over. So my first question, perhaps Glenda, is within the milk, does the PFAS tend to end up more in the drinking milk or in the solid part?
Both.
Okay.
Because it does it's water mobile, it's water mobile, and it does love proteins as well.
Hmm.
So it's a complicated question. I haven't seen a data set that, go ahead, Rick.
So one of the farms we worked at sells directly to consumer, and they process their own milk. So we were able to take both cream and skim milk samples, and we saw higher levels in PFAS in the cream versus the skim. So that's
Yeah.
as far as we got with that.
Yeah. More samples, the better, right? With everything. Okay. Rick, a couple of questions came in when you talked about disposing of the milk on the farm. And so can you talk a little bit more about about what happened to that milk? Where did it go? And what are some of the implications?
Yeah. So we spent a lot of time figuring out what's the best way to deal with that, both environmentally as well as economically, and
Hmm.
how do we deal with that? And it turns out some of this we used for trying to figure out destruction technology, so we could use some of that milk for that. And we worked with there were some companies that said they could deal with it, and some could, some couldn't. But most of that milk ended up back in the manure pit of that farm and then spread back out on the contaminated fields. That was our best option in terms of trying to minimize further spreading of the problem, keep it contained in that area. So, mix with the manure and then back out onto the farm fields that were already contaminated.
Thanks. I think that gives us a different perspective, right? We've been talking, focusing so much on how do we remove it, but sometimes it is about keeping it in a contained spot. Mark, question for you, and perhaps more in general. Did you have a liner under the compost to prevent leaching into the ground? Do you recommend having a liner underneath the mortality compost?
Um, Most of the time when we do mortality composting, we just put it right on the bare ground. In
Hmm.
the case of this farm, they had been composting their cows and pigs there for years and years. So we felt that a liner wouldn't make any sense because the ground was already contaminated or whatever the problem. So I believe as long as you have a good thick base that's going to absorb any leachate, you can get away without putting a liner down. And oftentimes a liner makes it more complicated because then you got to deal with how to dispose of the liner when you're done as well.
Thank you. A general question to all of you. Do you see health impacts on the animals, or is it really just what comes out in the milk, from PFAS?
Good question. So, of the farms that I've dealt with, I have not seen impacts on the health of the animals. So, the organic dairy farm, 150 milking cows with associated young stock. We were able to depurate all those animals, and they actually were sold to another organic dairy farm in New York once the animals had been depurated, once their milk was non-detect. That farm eventually sold their animals off to another farm. Um, we never saw any issues related to health impacts.
Uh, so to add on to that, there's been data um, on mice. We don't have good data for livestock. Um, in addition, the way that it just depends on their age too. So, dairy, the age of dairy cows potentially, and then they have a way to eliminate it via milk more readily than, a beef cow that has some, they do feed their calf, but I don't have good data to support any of this, but there's good data in humans. So, I think it might just be, the time of the lifespan of the animal, right?
Sure. Okay. Thank you. There's quite a few questions related to policy and regulations in Maine or elsewhere in the States, and we'll try our best to come to those eventually here. Whenever we look at the soil, should we be focusing primarily in that top 6 inches or top foot? What area of the soil would you recommend for sampling?
So we did standard sampling 6 to 8 inches with our soil probes. And that's what our agricultural PFAS specialists do now when they go out and sample. So they use a standard soil probe, 6 to 8 inches. We did do some sampling at one of the farms at various depths, and we actually saw PFAS higher concentrations lower in the soil profile, with 12 to 18 inches. So PFAS does leach. I mean, that's why we have so many contaminated wells. So, we didn't expect to see as high an increase in those lower levels, but that wasn't the case in all the fields. So it's interesting. I think we still need to better characterize what are the soil conditions. We haven't been able to pinpoint some of that. And Ellen Mallory is doing some of that work, trying to figure out, what soil conditions allow for increased leaching or changes in transfer factors. Still a lot of unknowns we still don't know yet.
Thank you. There have been some questions and comments about the spreading of biosolids, and it appears that biosolids are no longer allowed, or it's no longer allowed to spread biosolids in Maine. So can someone answer what does happen to the biosolids now?
Sure, I can. They're currently going to landfill. And it's kind of a difficult scenario because the costs have doubled, tripled, quadrupled for municipalities, and it's becoming a financial burden. So we're looking at other potential options to do with that material. But and I also saw in the chat, are all biosolids banned? And the answer is yes, except for septage. We still allow land application of septage, but it's not considered a biosolid. And biosolid is specifically municipal sewage sludge that has been treated.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions about, this concept of phytoremediation, and so what is the prognosis for phytoremediation for removing PFAS from the system?
So if you calculate how much we're pulling out through transfer factors, through plant uptake, compared to what we're seeing in soils, when we're seeing it 200, 300, 400 parts per billion of PFAS in the soil and the amount we're pulling out through the plants, it's going to take many generations to phytoremediate a field. I think our best option is to look at what kind of binders we could potentially apply. So biochar, high carbon ash is being looked at, a variety of things to try and sequester that PFAS in the soil so it's not taken up by the plant. That doesn't necessarily solve the problem long term, it's still there, but is there a way that we can bind it so it's not being taken up by the plant? I think that's the better option versus phytoremediation.
Okay.
Somebody else can join in, Mark or Glenda, whatever you think.
Rick, what do you think about what Mary Yelene is doing with the pine trees up north? I think that's kind of a neat idea.
Well, we're trying to find alternative crops that potentially could be used on some of these farm fields to keep these farms in business. And Christmas trees was one of those, but we're doing work on what's the uptake of PFAS into Christmas trees, and are people pulling these PFAS contaminated trees into their house at Christmas? Are we exposing them to more PFAS through the needles on the Christmas trees when we bring them in? And then, in Maine, a lot of Christmas trees end up as goat feed. So are we contaminating the goats with PFAS? So we have to look at the big picture here in terms of what's the end use and where that PFAS gets end up, and again, we're also putting a lot of Christmas trees as replacements for sand dunes along the coast. Yep. Are we, causing a problem to shellfish? Lots of things. You have to look at the big picture here with this product, because it is a forever chemical. It doesn't degrade. It's there. And how do we deal with it?
Question for Mark. In the compost trials, have you or will you look at, implications of using bulking agents without PFAS compared to the trials that you've done so far where the bulking agent did have PFAS in it as well?
Yeah, this last study, we actually used fairly clean material. And just worked with the animals being contaminated. And I think that that was the first time we actually had the time and the money to do the more serial type testing. So the next time that we do another study, which will probably be a replicate of this past summer, we're definitely going to do that again. So we'll look at all the different individuals.
Thank you. Then my next question is there a threshold at which point, is there a threshold below which we can um, remove that PFAS from the cow through milking versus having to look at euthanasia? Is there a threshold, or is it more a very cow specific answer? And I'll maybe put that one to Glenda.
Oh no, go ahead, Rick.
I was going to say it's more
It's
farm
case by
specific.
case.
Farm
Yeah.
specific.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's case by case. So that's why, it's great that we have this team that'll go to a farm and say, what are the resources? What do we have available for clean feed? What can we change in their cropping system that'll allow them to stay in business? Maine has set up a pretty significant financial aid package for a lot of these impacted farms. And, how do we make best use of that? Do we change that farm system completely? Do we try and keep them producing milk? Do we try and change them into a different farm system? All that comes into play, and it's farm by farm and contamination level by contamination level.
Plus, there's also the human factor. The Department of Agriculture has an animal welfare team, but they also have a bunch of compassionate veterinarians along with farm managers. And when decisions are made to euthanize the animals, they're not made quickly. They're made over long discussions about all the possible outcomes and options. And so that's really important that you have a whole team of people working with the farm. And the other thing is that they asked why we didn't do a lot of the testing of the material is because when that farmer made the decision, we had to go right then and there because they could change their mind. They were going through anguish, and we wanted to be in and out with the least amount of personal disturbance.
Well, I think we're gonna wrap things up with that note, knowing that this topic it goes beyond just the environment, right? It is truly a sustainability question where there's environmental, economic, and social implications. I want to express sincere thanks to our three speakers this afternoon for sharing their information or their experience, I should say, and their expertise on this topic. And I wouldn't be surprised if you get some more follow-up questions after the webinar as well.